that, I'm pleased to turn the floor over to our co-chair for the Arctic Policy Study Group, Mead Treadwell. Mead?
Thank you, Juanetta, and good morning, everyone. My name is Mead Treadwell. I'm co-chair of the study group, which Commonwealth North has formed to update our 2009 study called Why the Arctic Matters. And we're really pleased with this morning's program. I would just like, before we get started, to thank our collaborators on this project, which includes the Wilson Center, who is your host today, the Arctic Encounter Symposium, the Institute of the North, the Polar Research and Policy Institute, Arctic Today, and the Arctic Domain Awareness Center. And CHUKCHI, director of that center, General Key, will be joining Mike in moderating questions. Arctic 360, headed by Jessica Shadian in Toronto, has also been very, very helpful in this process. And Jessica, thank you. I'd also just like to recognize our co-chairs, Moira Birkenstadt, Admiral Tom Barrett, Bob Cox, and Gail Schubert are our co-chairs on this study. And if you have ideas or policy recommendations that you think should be included in the document that we are drafting this fall, be in touch with any one of us. And then lastly, I would like to welcome to today's presentation Lieutenant Governor Kevin Meyer. Lieutenant Governor, thank you for joining us, and thank you for being part of one of our earlier panels. Ambassador Mann, who is the European Union's Arctic ambassador, and John Negroponte, who is former Director of National Intelligence, former Deputy Secretary of State, former ambassador to the UN. But John, you got a special place in my heart because as a young reporter, I got to interview you when you were working on law of the sea issues and helping Alaska get control of its fisheries earlier in your career and early in my career. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Sfraga of the Wilson Center's Polar Institute, but also just want to say thank you to my colleague and longtime friend, David Balton, who I could just say this, for whatever America has accomplished in Arctic cooperation over the last generation, David Balton has been there, usually with the pen, always with incisive strategies and successful strategies. And David, it's a real pleasure to have you on our program this morning. And with that, let me hand it over to Michael.
Thank you, Mead, very much. And it's nice to see so many friends and colleagues online to join us this morning. So Mead and Juanetta, thank you. And Mead, thank you as co-chair of the Polar Institute. Thanks for your support over the years, certainly throughout our country here in the state and internationally as well. Again, thanks to all the friends for joining us. I want to thank CHUKCHI for helping with this effort. ADAC and the Wilson Center's Polar Institute, we have a nice bridge between Washington, D.C. and Alaska, and along with all of our other colleagues that Mead noted. So it's nice to see Team Arctic here first thing in the morning here in Alaska supporting the effort of Commonwealth North. And I think this is a really important program that they've put together throughout the coming months to help inform and influence the state's position in what has now become a global Arctic. With that, let me introduce my good friend and my colleague, Dave Balton. We were lucky enough to have Dave join us a couple of years ago, right out of the State Department. He now serves as a senior fellow in the Polar Institute and someone well known to our state across our country and throughout the Arctic region. And I might add the Antarctic regions as well. And before Dave joined the Institute, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans and Fisheries at Department of State, where he attained the rank of ambassador in 2006. And among the many things that Dave has done, as Mead has pointed out, he had coordinated U.S. foreign policy concerning oceans and fisheries related to the Arctic and Antarctic during the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council from 2015 to 17. He served as the chair of the senior Arctic officials. Importantly as well, he also co-chaired the Arctic Council's task force that produced, as many of you know, the 2011 Arctic Search and Rescue Agreement, which is a foundational agreement in the North as we try to overcome the tyranny of distance for issues like that, as well as the 2013 Arctic Oil Pollution Agreement. Before coming to the Wilson Center, Dave completed negotiations on the agreement to prevent unregulated high seas fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean. Again, another issue that touches us as Alaskans, but also all of the people throughout the circumpolar North. And this morning's program is entitled The Oceans Between Us, Governance and Cooperation in Arctic waters, something Dave knows very well. And as we all know, the pace of change in the Arctic is quickening, and this pace of change can be seen and felt across what I would call a broad range of interrelated, interconnected, integrated issues, and it's across a full spectrum of the economic, social, political, environmental, national, civil security landscapes. So it's with this backdrop that Dave has agreed to explore many important issues related to the Arctic Ocean and governance, including the fisheries agreement I just mentioned, overall issues related to Arctic governance, his perspectives on international cooperation, perhaps the role that Alaska should and could play influencing and informing policies going forward. And Dave, you and I have talked a number of times about this last bullet, which is no surprise, but perhaps you can also touch upon, in a limited time, long portfolio of issues to address, is the Russian Federation's interest in opening up a POLLOCK fishery in their EEZ in the CHUKCHI Sea, fish no boundary, and we share that boundary with the Russian Federation. And fisheries, of course, is important to the state of Alaska. So it's a long task, but I want to thank you, my friend and colleague, for joining us this morning. And with that, Dave, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Thanks very much, Mead, as well, for that introduction. Also want to express my appreciation to Commonwealth North for having me today. Good morning to all my friends in Alaska. Good afternoon to those listening where it is afternoon, and for those for whom it is evening, good evening to you. For the next 30 minutes or so, yes, I will try to go once over quickly all the things that Mike Sfraga said I should talk about. I will take a look at the Arctic Ocean. I will focus on a few key international issues that are of concern to the United States and to Alaska in particular. I will quickly review the institutions and arrangements that have been put in place for the Arctic Ocean. We'll spend perhaps an extra minute on the fisheries agreement, and Mead asked me to do that, as well as touch on some issues related to law of the sea and fisheries and boundaries and continental shelf issues. And I'll try to wrap up with a few thoughts about where we may be headed. But my first task is to try to share my screen. Let's see if this works. And let me put this on. And with a little bit of luck, everyone should be seeing an opening slide here. For those in Alaska, you probably don't need much of an orientation to the Arctic, but perhaps for some of you who haven't spent much time looking at the geography of the Arctic Ocean, here is a map it used to hang in my office at the State Department. Just going over quickly, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here's the top of Alaska, the Canadian Arctic archipelago, Kingdom of Denmark, represented here by Greenland, Iceland down here, Norway includes Svalbard, plus the mainland, Sweden and Finland, and the rest, of course, is the Russian Federation. I would encourage you to take a quick look at this purple line. This is the 200-mile line. That is to say, it is at every point 200 miles from the nearest point of land. And that comes up in a number of contexts in international law of importance. I'll touch on those a little later. Of course, the Arctic Ocean is changing dramatically. Climate change has caused a very serious disruption in ecosystems, a reduction in sea ice, among other things. It's already having dramatic consequences, as anybody in Alaska knows. At the same time, of course, it is also opening the Arctic Ocean, creating in some sense a new ocean, allowing for expanded range of human activities in the Arctic Ocean. And I would say that the governments of the region, other governments concerned with the Arctic, residents, including the Arctic indigenous peoples, other stakeholders, are scrambling to keep up with the fast pace of change. And we have together put in place a number of things that on its face seem quite impressive. A question in my mind is whether they will be adequate moving forward. I'm trying to advance the slide. Why won't it do that? Here we go.
Dave,
so,
this is,
very briefly, these are some of the main institutions, not all of them, for the Arctic that have come online recently, mostly recently. The Arctic Council, created in 1996, has the 8 Arctic states as members and Arctic indigenous peoples that participate essentially on an equal footing with the 8 governments in their own name and right. The Arctic Council has attracted some 40 observers, some non-Arctic states, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations. And it has a broad mandate, principally focused, not exclusively, but principally focused on environmental protection and sustainable development in the Arctic region. Even before there was an Arctic Council, there was an International Arctic Science Committee created in the early 90s to advance, coordinate science in the Arctic. The Arctic Council spun off or helped to facilitate two additional groups in the last sort of 5 years or so: the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, the Arctic Economic Council, kind of partners with the Arctic Council in advancing cooperation in the Arctic. I've included the International Maritime Organization here. This is a global organization that has been around for decades, long before any of the others. But in the last decade or more, it has begun to focus part of its attention on the Arctic region. I'll talk about some of the things that have been done through the International Maritime Organization just in the last few years. Since 2011, and Mike alluded to some of this, no fewer than 5 binding international agreements for the Arctic have come online. Quite amazing. I'm not sure the same could be said for any other particular region of the world, certainly no other ocean region of the world. And just running through them briefly, in 2011, as Mike said, we reached agreement, the first of its kind among the 8 Arctic states, to cooperate on search and rescue activities in the Arctic. Why? Well, with the Arctic Ocean opening and more people headed into the Arctic Ocean, there was a concern that there would be more search and rescue incidents, and that each of the Arctic states independently were not as well prepared as they might be to deal with this need. So through this agreement, the 8 governments agreed to share resources, help each other out in the event of an incident, do joint training and share data. And there have already been a number of exercises, other kinds of implementation of this agreement over the last 9 years or so. 2 years later, in somewhat the same, motivated by somewhat of the same instinct, the 8 Arctic governments came together and signed the 2013 Arctic Marine Oil Pollution Preparedness and Response Agreement. The picture you see there is actually from the Gulf of Mexico, the Deepwater Horizon disaster. But there was great concern that if some incident like that took place in the Arctic Ocean, it would be even worse, right? Because there is all that much less infrastructure to support efforts to deal with such situations. And of course, the tyranny of distance, the harsh conditions. Anyway, through this 2013 agreement, once again, the nations of the Arctic agreed to help each other out, pool resources, conduct joint training and exercises, share data, so that if there were a major oil pollution incident, they'd be better prepared to respond. And the final agreement that was negotiated, like the first 2 under the auspices of the Arctic Council, was signed in Fairbanks just a few years ago. The 2017 Arctic Science Cooperation, intended, of course, to enhance scientific cooperation throughout the region. I'm proud to say that in all 3 cases, the United States was in the lead in helping to shepherd these negotiations successfully. In the first 2 cases, I was privileged to co-chair Arctic Council task forces, along with a Russian colleague, and in the case of the oil pollution agreement, also a Norwegian colleague. My friend from State Department, Evan Bloom, co-chaired with a Russian colleague the negotiations that produced the Arctic Science Cooperation Agreement in 2017. Oops, once again, go this way. Back now to the International Maritime Organization. It produced the 4th binding agreement for the Arctic, also the Antarctic region, by issuing the so-called Polar Code, entered into force in 2017. This is a suite of rules, really amendments to pre-existing treaties designed to improve the security and environmental capabilities of ships traveling through the Arctic, also the Antarctic region. The IMO has also put in place a voluntary traffic separation scheme for the Bering Strait region, proposed jointly by the United States and Russia in the last 2 years, and is continuing to work on shipping issues of interest to the Arctic, including a possible phase out or ban of heavy fuel oil in the Arctic of the sort that has already been put in place for the Antarctic. And the last of these binding agreements is this agreement relating to the Central Arctic Ocean on fisheries. About a decade ago, the United States took an unusual step. It chose to prohibit, for all intents and purposes, commercial fisheries in the part of its exclusive economic zone north of the Bering Strait, north of the coast of Alaska. Why? Well, because there simply wasn't enough scientific information with which to manage a fishery in that area properly. But of course, US jurisdiction over fisheries in the ocean only extends to 200 miles from shore. The same is true for all the other countries that rim the Central Arctic Ocean, leaving a large high seas area, this dark blue area in the center of the Arctic Ocean, in which, in principle, vessels from any nation would be permitted to fish. Now, there has been no commercial fishing in this area, and there hasn't been in all of recorded history, because the area has been covered by ice year-round until now. Now, a portion of that dark area, a portion of the high seas area, is open water for at least part of the year. And the amount that is open water and the amount of the year in which it is in that condition are both growing. And so that raised concerns here in the United States initially that vessels from other countries would come and start fishing at mile 201. Congress passed a joint resolution signed into law by George W. Bush calling for an international agreement to do for the high seas area essentially what the United States had done within its exclusive economic zone, namely prevent commercial fishing, at least until there is an adequate structure in place to manage it properly. And over the course of several years, working first with the other states that surround this area, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and Russia, and then after that with a group of other states, including China, Japan, South Korea, Iceland, and also the EU, we produced an agreement that prohibits commercial fishing in the high seas area for at least 16 years following entry into force of the agreement. And it also commits these 10 to create a joint program of scientific research and monitoring related to potential future fisheries in that area. All 10 have signed the agreement. 9 of the 10 have completed the ratification process, including the United States. The only signatory not yet finished with the ratification process is China. I was recently in touch with officials in the government of China to inquire about where they are, and they reaffirmed their intent to ratify this agreement. They said they had been slowed down thanks to the pandemic and other issues, but I'm confident the agreement will enter into force pretty soon. Mead had asked whether there were other international fisheries of interest to Alaska, and I would say in the Arctic Ocean, generally speaking, the answer is no, now that this Arctic Fisheries Agreement for the high seas area is coming online. However, as Mike mentioned, there have been reports in the press that Russia is thinking of initiating a commercial fishery for pollock in the Chukchi Sea on its side of the US-Russia boundary line. I don't actually know how serious or well-developed this idea is within Russia, but I would have to say that, at least from where I sit, the prospect of a new fishery there should be of some concern to people in the United States and in Alaska in particular. The pollock stock, if it exists in adequate quantities in the Chukchi Sea to support a commercial fishery at all, almost certainly originates in the Bering Sea and largely in the US side of the Bering Sea. And so I would want to know at a minimum what scientific information Russia has suggesting that a commercial fishery is possible and could be managed sustainably. But even if there is enough pollock to support a fishery there are questions in my mind about the politics and the strategy of this. Remember, there is no commercial fishing allowed in the Chukchi Sea on the US side of the line. And just looking back here, Russia, the United States, and a bunch of other countries are trying to get all other countries to commit not to fish in the high seas area. Is a really good strategy for Russia to begin a pollock fishery in the Chukchi Sea within its EEZ at a time when we're getting these other countries to make that commitment. So those are some questions I have about this issue, and I have to talk more about that if people wish. Mead asked me to say a word or two about the Law of the Sea Convention. Some of you online may know all this already, but for those who may not, very briefly, in 1982, through the United Nations was produced the main international instrument relating to the oceans generally, the Convention on the Law of the Sea. Virtually all of the important countries in the world, virtually all the countries in the world, important or otherwise, have joined the convention. The United States has not. But it hasn't been for the want of trying. 3 times in the last 20 years or so, under, well, even more under President Clinton, under President George W. Bush, and under President Obama, the administration pushed the Senate to approve the treaty. And 3 times in that time span, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held hearings, high-level hearings on the convention. Twice, 2 of those times, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee actually approved the agreement, but the full Senate has never done so. And the United States at the moment remains a non-party. We do follow the rules of the Law of the Sea Convention as a matter of practice, and the United States indeed is of the opinion or of the view that most of the rules embedded in the convention reflect customary international law, as the international lawyers like to say. But the fact that we are a non-party does entail certain risks and certain costs, and one of them is particularly true with respect to Alaska, and I thought I would take a moment to look at that issue. It has to do with the entitlement that a state bordering the ocean has to continental shelf. And if you bear with me for just a couple minutes, I'll go through Continental Shelf 101 very quickly. If you are a nation with a coastline like the United States, like, say, Alaska with respect to, say, the Arctic Ocean, you are entitled to a continental shelf that extends at least 200 nautical miles from shore. Here we're talking about the seafloor, not the water column, but the land under the water. And what it means to have a continental shelf, it means you have exclusive rights to all the resources that sit on the shelf, and more importantly, that are embedded within the shelf, say oil, gas, minerals, etc. And if, as a coastal state, you can demonstrate that the seafloor beyond 200 miles meets certain criteria, if you can demonstrate that it is part of the natural prolongation of the continent on which your country sits, you get that piece of seafloor as part of your continental shelf as well. And with it, of course, exclusive rights to the very same types of resources. What does this mean in the Arctic? Well, now if you take a look at this kind of crazy looking map in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, once again, we have the 200-mile line. The seafloor closer to shore is, of course, part of the continental shelf of each of the 5 countries that rim this area. But then it turns out that most of the seafloor beyond 200 miles meets the criteria, or appears to meet the criteria set in the Law of the Sea Convention to belong to one or another of these 5 countries: USA, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and Russia. Now, a number of those areas will overlap with one another. What happens when there is an overlap? Well, typically the governments involved negotiate a boundary line separating one country's entitlement from another. And indeed, the United States and Russia have such a boundary in place dating all the way back to 1990, separating what might be Russia's extended continental shelf from what might be the US continental shelf. But we, the United States, do not have a boundary agreement in place with Canada and the Beaufort Sea. Canada and Russia, Denmark and Russia similarly do not have boundary agreements in place. And so as this process plays out, there will ultimately be a need for boundaries to be drawn. Now, coming back to the Law of the Sea Convention, here is a problem. The best way to get other countries to recognize the outer limits of your continental shelf is by participating in a process set out in the Law of the Sea Convention where those outer limits are made final and binding. The process, briefly, is that the country submits scientific data to a group of experts. The group of experts send back recommendations to the country in question about where the outer limits ought to be. If the country in question, in fact, sets those outer limits in accordance with those recommendations, then the outer limit of your continental shelf is final and binding, and for all intents and purposes, all other countries in the world need to recognize that in perpetuity. A question arises: can a nation such as the United States participate in this process without joining the Law of the Sea Convention? We don't know. It's never been done. We, the United States, believe that that continental shelf is ours, whether or not we join the convention. Not all other governments agree with that. And it's not clear if we try to go through this process I've just described as a non-party to the convention, what will actually happen. We would certainly be on much better footing going through this process as a party to the Law of the Sea Convention. And that, in my view, is one of the key arguments about why the United States still needs to join the Law of the Sea Convention. Not the only argument, but a key one, and perhaps the one of most interest to Alaska. Mead asked me to say a word about freedom of navigation in the Arctic. I'll go through this quickly. On this slide, you see the two main routes currently in use, at least somewhat, in the Arctic. The so-called Northern Sea Route running through the Bering Strait and across the top of Russia, and actually a series of routes heading through the Canadian archipelago that collectively are known as the Northwest Passage. There already has been some significant increase in shipping along the Northern Sea Route. That is the side of the Arctic that is melting first, and Russia is investing considerable resources in trying to develop shipping in that region. There have been transits of the Northwest Passage from time to time, but we're still quite a ways from it being a major route for commercial shipping. The issue, or one issue in the Arctic, has to do with the following. The United States believes that vessels from all countries are entitled to pass through either of these routes without the consent of either Russia in the case of the Northern Sea Route or Canada in the case of the Northwest Passage. The United States is also of the view that any rules relating to the passage of vessels through these areas are to be developed collectively, multilaterally, principally through the International Maritime Organization. Canada has a very different view. In particular, it says that most of the Northwest Passage is, in a sense, internal waters internal to Canada, sort of like the Yukon River is an internal water in the United States, and the Hudson River. Canada believes that non-Canadian vessels can only pass through those waters with the consent of Canada, and then the rules related to passage are those to be developed by Canada. And Russia, for its part, has similar views for parts of the Northern Sea Route. For the time being, the countries can agree to disagree, but as shipping increases in both of these places, it may become a more significant point of friction. And indeed, there is talk in the United States about conducting some kind of freedom of navigation exercise, particularly in the Russian Northern Sea route, sending US military vessels through there to make the point that vessels of any country can, in fact, navigate this area. For what it's worth, I think that's not a good idea, and a lot of things could possibly go wrong. And there are other ways the United States has to make its point of view on this type of issue known. Anyway, I'm happy to talk more about that if people wish. Mead also asked me to touch on the unresolved boundary situation that the United States and Canada have. This is in the Beaufort Sea. You'll see at the bottom of this map the land boundary between the United States and Canada, Alaska and the Yukon Territory. It's the 141st meridian. Canada's view is that that land boundary was also intended to be the boundary in the ocean, the maritime boundary heading due north, straight in the direction of the North Pole, as long presumably as it needs to go. The US view is that the land boundary was only ever intended to be a land boundary. And at the point where it meets the ocean, a maritime boundary should be drawn, as maritime boundaries usually are drawn, on the basis of equidistance, a line heading out to sea that is at every point as close to a point of land in one country as it is to another. And the equidistant line you can see here heading in this dotted line heading sort of northeasterly. And this creates, within 200 miles of shore, a kind of triangle of water, seafloor, that both countries claim. As it happens, there is also an unresolved boundary situation between the two countries beyond 200 miles as it relates to the continental shelf. And my own sense, and probably most of the people who've looked at this, is that probably a resolution of this boundary situation should be done all at the same time. That is to say, some perhaps splitting of the difference or other resolution of this boundary situation, both within and beyond 200 miles, should take place as part of a single negotiation. And that we're not really ready to negotiate concerning the area beyond 200 miles because we still don't know exactly where our continental shelf is and that of Canada is and where the overlaps are. And so for the time being, at least, it's left to the two governments to kind of manage this overlapping area, prevent any serious incidents from taking place. And I'm happy to say that the good neighbors that US and Canada are, we have successfully managed this boundary situation for many years, and nobody's gotten hurt over it. Still, over the long run, I do believe it's important for all boundaries to be resolved, including this one. To wrap up, where are we headed? Well, the Arctic since the end of the Cold War has been remarkable in the high level of cooperation that has existed among the governments and the peoples of the Arctic. It has been a stable, peaceful part of the world, certainly compared to a lot of other parts of the world. But of late, tensions have arisen. The United States has certainly expressed concern over actions by Russia, particularly buildup of its military capabilities in the Arctic and other provocative steps it has taken. The United States has also expressed concern about Chinese activities in the Arctic, and in particular about potential undue influence China might be seeking to have through its investing in certain places in the Arctic. And from where I sit, this is of note, and it does bear close watch. On the other hand, my sense is that a lot of the talk about this and the piece in the press are kind of overblown. We're not on the brink of war in the Arctic anywhere close. And indeed, my hope is that the Arctic will remain, on balance, a peaceful place marked by continuing cooperation among the governments. But we will see what the future brings. We have, of course, put in place a lot to try to govern the Arctic. I walked quickly through many aspects of that. But my own sense is that all the things that have been put in place do not in total amount to enough. That with more people headed to the Arctic, with climate change continuing to change the dynamics in the Arctic region, the countries in question will need to create some new or improved framework for governing human activities in this area in the future. I hope we get there. And finally, a word about Alaska's role. Well, the United States would not be in the Arctic but for Alaska. And during my time in government, I was quite attentive to and impressed by the interest that Alaskans have demonstrated about the Arctic. Indeed, much of US policy is based on projecting and promoting the interests of Alaska. Of course, they are not a single set of interests. There are particular interests that the Alaska state government has, another set of interests that the Arctic indigenous peoples in Alaska have, the Native Alaskans. There are industry groups in Alaska who care about the Arctic, not all in the same way. There are environmental and scientific organizations that have particular things based in Alaska, particular things to say about the Arctic. And my sense is that it's vital for all of these different Alaskans, Alaskan interests to continue to be put forward and to continue to insist to the US government that these interests be taken firmly into account in advancing US Arctic policy at the international level. There is a lot more that could be said about this, but I think for now, I will stop there and turn it back over to Mike and to others who might wish to offer their own thoughts, and happy to take questions from anybody listening in. Thanks very much.
Dave, thank you for that tour de force. A lot of landscape, figuratively and otherwise, covered in a very short period of time. Thank you for all of that, many of which are woven into issues that the Alaskans are certainly thinking about, and I think that it's very helpful for Commonwealth North. I would not doubt that they reach out to you for some additional insight and guidance as they work through the process. I do want to do two things. One is to ask my partner in crime, CHUKCHI, to perhaps give some reflection. Dave, he may have a question or two for you. And then Dave, in preparation, I have a number of questions on the chat line regarding UNCLOS and the US's position on that. Basically, the bottom line is why? Why have we taken this position? But first, just to prep you, but first, let me turn it over to Church and ask him for his thoughts or perhaps a question related to Dave's presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and Ambassador Balton, exceptional tour de force. I frankly could listen to 3 or 4 more hours of just reflections, because the devil's in the details here, and the time, of course, only permits you to really get the wave toss, but there are certainly some remarkable details I know you could provide those of us who are really students of the conversations that you've highlighted the last 40 minutes. I just have, from my vantage point, exceptional rundown on the fact that what constitutes the strategic challenges between nations many times is that of the boundary agreements. And really right now it's quite remarkable that the United States and Canada have been able to muddle through in unresolved boundary issues for quite some time. The Pie Wedge and the Northwest Passage have been something that I go back to in the 1989 discussion between Prime Minister Mulroney and President Reagan that really articulated about we're going to agree to disagree on this one because we have too much at stake and we're not going to resolve this, but we're going to be fine with each other's respective national position. But I take a look at 1989 to today's context, and in 1989 we didn't worry about as much, obviously, as the diminishing ice Arctic and certainly the diminishing ice sheet, reducing the barriers of access for people and nations to enter into the Arctic region. And so one of the classic arguments from our Canadian allies that I've heard repeated many, many times is when we think about our respective national security interests in the North American Arctic, and the fact is that Canada has said, wouldn't it be more in the US interest in the case of the Northwest Passage to actually decide to agree with Canada on this and to allow it to be labeled as internal waters based on the geography and interpretation of geography, and more importantly, based on the aspects that if Canada had this as internal waters, they could reduce the national security threats or challenges by our competitors, specifically the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. So I'd like to kind of throw that out there as a big old softball, perhaps a big old watermelon of a question, but I would love your reflection on this to kind of get this conversation underway. Your thoughts, sir?
Thanks very much, Church. Yeah, I've heard Canadian counterparts make the same point to me and to my colleagues many times. I would say that it's unlikely that the United States will join in the Canadian position for at least two reasons. Our view is that the Northwest Passage is a strait used for international navigation. And it's hardly the only such strait around the world. There are all sorts of straits, including the Bering Strait, but strategic straits like the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Gibraltar and the Strait of Malacca. I could go on. And US interests in freedom of navigation through all those straits, particularly for our Navy, but also for our commercial vessels, is incredibly important. And so to agree with Canada that this is not a strait, among other things, calls into question the status of these other areas. And the Canadian argument that by acknowledging the Northwest Passage to be internal waters helps protect us somehow, particularly from Russian vessels that might wish to transit through there, strikes me as problematic from a geographic point of view. The Russian vessels are not coming from that direction. We do have shared interests with Canada. We certainly want vessels coming across the top of Alaska and heading through or coming out of the Northwest Passage to be safe and secure. And it seems to me that's the common interest with Canada we want to build on. We want to create a set of rules to make sure that there's not going to be, or at least minimize the chances that there would be a serious maritime incident involving any vessel coming through the Northwest Passage.
Ambassador, thank you. I guess one follow-up to this is that you've worked these, and for the record, I agree with you 100%, but I do know that my Canadian colleagues have been beat over the head on this issue a lot of times personally, simply because Americans who are worrying about the space, we usually get approached by our Canadian allies about this quite often. You had the privilege and really the great honor to represent the United States in negotiating some landmark agreements in the Arctic region. One thing I'd like to ask you, and then go to the rest of our colleagues here, is as you look at the challenges that are looming in the Arctic today, what specific area of needed agreement would you want to try to tackle in really, say this is the next agreement that we should really put some time and effort towards? And I'll give the floor back to my distinguished colleague, Mike.
Thanks very much, Church. Well, we may be at a moment when the governments of the Arctic are not in the right mood to pursue yet another binding agreement. The US administration, the Russian Federation's government don't seem particularly open to such new ideas. But if they were, or if circumstances were to change, I think one next step that should not be particularly frightening to anybody might be to create a marine science organization dedicated specifically to the Central Arctic Ocean. There is such an organization for the North Pacific, the North Pacific Marine Science Organization, and a counterpart, much older counterpart, for the North Atlantic. And both of those bodies are doing work in the Central Arctic Ocean, but I think we might be better off if we could create a dedicated marine science organization for the Central Arctic Ocean. So that might be the next step I'd recommend.
I would say amen. I would love that. Sir, back to you, Michael.
Thanks, Church. Great questions and great perspective. Dave, thanks for the response. I have a number of questions coming in, Dave. Perhaps I'd like to go back to UNCLOS, because that, once you opened up that can, we've seemed to have gone down that, which is a good one. So a question from Fran Ulmer is, Dave, could you explain in a short period of time, the role of the group that will decide disputes between the countries over their extended continental shelf, or at least entertain that. I don't know that people know that within, UNCLOS there is a group, and who is that group that decides, or at least adjudicates the claims that might come in from the countries, and whether our failure as a country to ratify the agreement puts us at a disadvantage in that process. And then, so that's one. And then related to that is the big question as to why the United States has not ratified the agreement.
There are whole books written on both of those topics, but the short version of the answer to both questions would go something like this. The Law of the Sea Convention creates a group of 21 scientific experts. They're called the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. Their sole job is not to adjudicate overlapping areas, but simply to tell any given state that asks, does this area qualify as continental shelf? And very often, a particular area of seafloor can qualify as the continental shelf of more than one country, sometimes two, sometimes multiple countries. And then it's up to the countries themselves to resolve those overlaps. This commission has no role in that process whatsoever. Fran also asked, is the US at a disadvantage? And I was trying to say in my presentation, yes, I think we are. If the United States attempted to submit our information to the Commission, it's not at all clear that the Commission would accept it and review it. I hope they would. There's nothing in the Law of the Sea Convention that tells them they cannot. But no other non-party has attempted to do this. And it's at least possible that as a non-party, our claim or our submission of information might be rejected or simply not acted on. And that would, I think, create some serious problem for the United States. Remember, the continental shelf, we believe, still belongs to us, but getting other countries to recognize where it is and where it comes to an end is not easy to do unless you can pass through this process. The second question, why are we not a party to the convention? That is long and complicated. Initially, it had to do with rules relating to the mining of the seafloor beyond any country's continental shelf. Those rules were actually changed in 1994 from the original convention. And so most of those objections, I think, have been adequately addressed. But in the last few times the Senate has considered it, some other problems have come up. Some senators are worried about the United States having to participate in dispute settlement over issues that we'd rather not have a court or a tribunal pass on. And there are other kinds of financial costs associated with joining the convention, all of which are actually pretty minor, but nevertheless were held out as concerns. But from at least where I sit, any sober assessment of US interests in the ocean and the costs and benefits of joining the convention militate in favor of joining. And I do think that ultimately we will have to join. When and how and who and why, can't quite say.
Thank you, Dave. Another question from Sarah Cobb. So we're going to go from UNCLOS back to Arctic Council and governance structures. Sarah asks, she would like to have your perspective, Dave, on the capacity, and something we've talked about a lot, you and I and others, the capacity of the Arctic Council as a type of governance structure to address the security aspects that you touched upon a little bit, given that they have indicated, the Council has indicated that these are not issues that they would like to consider outside of their purview. Can you give some thought to that, and maybe I'll follow up based on what your perspectives are.
Okay, so the one topic that was expressly excluded from the mandate of the Arctic Council when the Council was created was military security issues. And from where I sit, that's probably a good thing because it has allowed the Council to focus on other sorts of issues without getting embroiled in military security matters. There are other types of security, including, say, search and rescue or environmental security, food security, that the Arctic Council has worked on and produced good work about, and I hope that continues. But especially during periods of heightened tensions between Russia and other other Arctic countries. There have been a lot of people hoping that some new forum can be created where at least the two sides can talk to each other and reduce the risk of miscalculation or other unintended sources of conflict in the Arctic. The Arctic Council will not be that place, but perhaps another such place can be created.
Thank you, David. Just to follow up on that note, I would say that just to share with others, you may already know this, that the Wilson Center and the Munich Security Conference have been in discussion about some type of discussion point on the sidelines of what we currently facilitate for the Munich Security Conference with our friends NUPI in Oslo, and that is to create some kind of forum for these kind of mill-to-mill or higher level security issues. Ever since Ukraine and Crimea, there's not been that robust discussion between the militaries, the 7 other nations in the Arctic and the Russian Federation. It is a rather touchy situation. That's one thing, but we are working on something that could resemble a very productive discussion. We have found during our Munich Security Conference discussions that these are closed door roundtables, but they have progressed into almost a track 2 discussion where we can actually have really good dialogue. It's not mill to mill, but it is of the highest order with foreign ministers, defense ministers, and even heads of state. So there is understanding and an appreciation for that kind of discussion at a broader circumpolar level, knowing full well that the pace of change and the issues of security are important. I would also note that a lot of us have tried to wedge into that discussion the issue of civil security. It's not just hard security. There's water security, food security, community security, health security in the North that needs to be addressed as well. I'm watching our time, and Juanetta will let me know if we run over or not, but we have a few minutes left. Dave, there's a question about, this is from Mead. The question is, didn't we unilaterally extend the EEZ to 200 miles in 1976 without signing UNCLOS?
Yes, the United States created the EEZ in the mid-70s, as Mead recalls correctly. So did a lot of other countries. The law of the Sea Convention was not yet a thing. The United Nations didn't adopt it until 1982. And what the Law of the Sea Convention did was it recognized the entitlement of countries, including the United States, to have EEZs out to 200 miles. So yeah, the establishment of our EEZ came first. The Law of the Sea Convention came second. He remembers that correctly.
Yeah, thank you. And I also know we have a comment from Monk who says annual meetings of the chiefs of defense were initiated by Canada, but put on hold after Ukraine, and that's exactly, of course, exactly right. There was a forum, but that also, Dave, maybe your perspective here, there wasn't what I've called the Arctic bubble around the Arctic, or that this zone of peace and this Arctic exceptionalism going on, but there certainly was the sense and even the feel and the look that the Arctic was semi-immune to these outside geopolitical issues. And what we have seen, like your perspective, we've seen is a little pressure on that bubble now, because as you know, we've been in meetings where other issues had not come up, but we were focused on the Arctic. And now when you have Arctic meetings, the issues of Syria, Ukraine, Crimea, cyber, that happen elsewhere in the world now have pressured Arctic Council and other bodies in the North, where you simply are not immune from the external geopolitics anymore. There is this pressure. So A, if you agree with that, please let me know or disagree. And 2, give me your sense of how the Arctic Council can, will, should navigate this new Arctic related to these external pressures, because it's no longer immune to the other issues around the world.
I basically agree with your assessment, Mike. The Arctic, until fairly recently, seemed, if not immune, at least largely insulated from the pressures arising from serious disagreements between Russia on the other hand and the other Arctic states, particularly after the invasion of Crimea. Yes, differences vis-a-vis Syria actually began before then, I think as early as 2011. Then there was election interference, all sorts of stuff creating static in the relationship, particularly between the United States and Russia. And yet, throughout the period, at least throughout, say, the end of 2017, the countries in question acted as though they wanted to compartmentalize the Arctic, continued to cooperate, and they indeed had mutual interests there that they pursued. Of late, however, it's not obvious that this kind of cooperation can continue. Indeed, the last time the Arctic Council met at the ministerial level at the end of May of 2019, it could not even reach agreement on a declaration of the sort that it had always adopted in such meetings before, reportedly because the United States refused to accept language on climate change that all the other countries, including Russia, wanted to see in the declaration. What will happen going forward? Well, now the Arctic Council is also hamstrung at least a little bit by the pandemic, the way a lot of other international fora are. It's harder to get work done virtually, particularly in the Arctic, because of time zone issues, than it has been in the past. But the pandemic will at some point ease, and perhaps tensions among the countries may ease as well. And my hope is that the Arctic Council and the other Arctic institutions can continue to be the engine of cooperation in the Arctic for years to come. We'll see.
Thank you. I'd like to do now is call an audible, because we've come up on at least 9 a.m. here in Alaska, and ask Juanetta how we are doing on time, and if we, I think we have maybe 1 or 2 more questions, but how are we doing on time, and do we want to end here?
Thanks, Mike. That's really largely up to you and your indulgence of us. I do see some additional questions, and if you have a few more minutes to entertain a few of those, we can go a little bit longer.
Okay, thank you, Juanetta, for allowing me the audible. Dave, thanks for the thumbs up. A question, Dave, back to UNCLOS in the state of Alaska. So the question and statement is this: the Alaska State Legislature has also expressed reluctance to participate in the law of the sea, and this is from an advisory resolution standpoint. If you would advise the Alaska Legislature on this topic, what factors do you think they should consider determining future positions on the law of the sea? And again, it's from an Alaskan perspective.
So I respect the views of the Alaska Legislature, and they're hardly the only group in the United States who has offered views like that. I would love to be able to talk with them at greater length than I have the opportunity here to sort of impress upon them the costs of staying outside the regime. There are both the sort of financial costs of perhaps not securing recognition of our continental shelf in the Arctic and also in the Bering Sea, I might add, that may have serious financial consequences. There's also a political cost. Every other country in the Arctic is party to the convention, and it hampers our ability to influence other governments on law of the sea related issues if we are a non-party. One example from outside the Arctic is that as a non-party, it's harder for us to make the point to China that it needs to abide by the rules of the Law of the Sea Convention in the South China Sea. When China responds, why should we listen to you? You haven't even signed up to those rules. Anyway, there is a lot more that could be said about this, and I'd be happy to engage with the Alaska State Legislature at any time they wish.
My sense is that you might get an invite now, having opened that as well. Let me go back to just take, Juanetta, it's okay, we'll just take a couple more minutes here. Church, any last thoughts and perspectives from your standpoint? And then Dave, I have just one other follow-up with you, but I want to check back in with you.
Mike, thank you. So Ambassador Balton, exceptional reflections here. I guess one thing I've been thinking about since you're one of those reflections regarding the previous Arctic Chiefs of Defense Forum, knowing that where the Arctic Council today is really, is stayed away from the conversation on developing great power competition, and is really focused on those other aspects of help, trying to be that hand of help across the Arctic region. At what point, or what sort of scenario could you imagine developing that could cause the Arctic Council to say, let's rethink this one a bit? Maybe there is a role that the Arctic Council could advise on, perhaps to the UN Security Council or others, to address areas of concern that the collective body thinks, especially when you think about those indigenous voices and those the six indigenous groups that are really under one protectoral, under the Secretariat now. Could you envision a scenario that would cause a relook of this, the Arctic Council, to say maybe we need to think through a rapprochement into the context of security because it's in our interest to advance our other elements of the agenda? Just offer that as a thought, and I would love to see your thinking, or listen to your thinking on it.
Thanks, Church. Well, there certainly has been a lot of discussion about how the Arctic Council ought to continue its evolution. It already has evolved quite a lot. When the US was chairing the Arctic Council a number of years ago, we set in motion an effort to create a long-term strategic plan for the Arctic Council that might, among other things, reorient its mandate in certain ways and strengthen its operations. But I can tell you that at no point along those discussions, including up to this moment, to the best of my knowledge, has there been a serious proposal to bring into the Arctic Council military security issues. I don't think any of the governments involved, and I don't think the permanent participant organizations either, would welcome that. They may see the need to have the governments in question, perhaps with the participation of the Arctic indigenous peoples, to grapple with those issues. But I think there is a fear that bringing those issues into the Arctic Council would hamper, maybe seriously hamper, the good work that the Council does by, and is allowed to do by keeping those issues out. So as I said earlier, I think it would be better and probably more likely to create some forum outside the Arctic Council to serve this purpose, not the Arctic Council itself.
Master, thank you. And that makes lots of sense. And I just find some way to think through how indigenous concerns of those six participants, how do they get somehow tabled into the context of security? And I look at security from both the defense side, but also from the law enforcement side. And that's and those elements really bridge, So anyway, your reflections make lots of sense, and I respectfully agree with them, frankly. Michael, I'll give the floor back to you, sir. Thanks, Ambassador, for your indulgence.
Thanks, Church. Dave, I have one more. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the Healy and the, as we all know on this call, the U.S. is in desperate need of having at least some icebreaker capacity above and beyond what we currently have, with both of our now heavy and our medium Coast Guard our icebreakers hamstrung, let's put it that way. And the recent notification from the Coast Guard that the Healy ran into some mechanical trouble with a fire and headed back to port. Your thoughts on the US's need for not just the two that we have up and running, but sort of your perspective on their role, the need for, hopefully, more, but also their continued role and continued importance in many of the issues that you brought up today. So I'm linking both the realities of the US position right now vis-a-vis Coast Guard icebreakers and our capacity, but also their role in the future Arctic as well. And then after you're done with that, Dave, I'll just do a...
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, we certainly need greater icebreaking capacity than we have. And that's been true for a long time. And the current problems with the Healy just serve to shine a spotlight on the lack of capacity. We are in the process, right, of creating a new heavy icebreaker. It'll hopefully come online sooner rather than later. And there is a plan, excuse me, to build some more that I hope we actually complete. The Coast Guard has 11 different statutory missions, many of which in the Arctic can be pursued best through additional icebreaking capacity. We also have responsibilities vis-a-vis Antarctica that require icebreaking capacity, preferably under US flag as well, though in the past sometimes we have chartered icebreakers from other countries for those purposes, including from Russia. So there is also a kind of political or optical issue related to icebreaking capacity. It is a way that countries demonstrate commitment to and seriousness of purpose about the Arctic. And I think when our new icebreaker comes online, and hopefully others beyond that, it will help to show both ourselves and other governments that we really are here. We have a presence in the Arctic beyond that which we have had to date. So I hope we continue down this path.
Thank you, Dave. And thanks for spending our morning with us and your afternoon and evenings abroad. For those listening into this. And Juanetta, I want to hand it back to you. I think just in real time, just based on, let me make a recommendation, is that perhaps we come back sometime in the future and tease out a little bit more on the Arctic Council. There's also other issues related to civil security, especially the strategic position of the Bering Strait. There's some other issues that I think are of particular interest to Commonwealth North, but also those online as well, just based on some input, my own input as well. So Juanetta, I'll hand it back to you and to me.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you to Ambassador Balton and to CHUKCHI for participating today. And we appreciate the program very much. Yes, it is a rich topic, and I think that there's great interest in it. I will note that Mike, you and your colleagues at the Wilson Center and the Polar Institute are scheduled to be back with us on September 30th to explore more issues around the Arctic Council. And we'll have another additional session on other international models of cooperation following that one. With that, let me just thank everybody again for joining us today. As a heads up, we will have a session next week on the 2nd of September. And again, you have to register for each event to participate. So if you're interested in that session, I will be providing the link in the chat session that's available to you now. We'll be talking about state and federal lands in Alaska's Arctic. Our two speakers will be State Director for the Bureau of Land Management, Chad Paget, and Deputy Commissioner for the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, Sarah Longen. And so please do join us for that session as well. I will also mention for the Alaskans and well, anybody online, that we do have another program today at noon, which is on elections. Elections do matter, and we have an important ballot on the fall general election ballot regarding some sweeping reforms to our electoral processes. So we do encourage you to participate in that session. Catherine Gale will be the keynote speaker. She's the author of The Politics Industry, along with Michael Porter. And we also will have two Alaska attorneys who will talk specifically about ballot measure 2. So please join us for that program as well. And with that, let me turn it back to our co-chair, Mead Treadwell. Mead, if you'd like to say any closing words, please.
I think all I'd like to say is thank you, David. You gave us lots of information to use on the study. And for those of you who have been wondering about how we're going to structure the study group, we plan to have a briefing dedicated to that sometime in the next few weeks. But the question of whether or not we should advocate for law of the sea or unilateral action, as discussed today, was important. How to strengthen the other dialogue that we heard about today was important. And please send us your ideas. This has been very, very fruitful today. And David, again, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mead. And just for everyone's information, we will be posting a recording of today's session along with Ambassador Balton's slides on the Arctic Study Group webpage. Again, you can find that link in the chat. You can also save the chat file by selecting the ... menu and downloading that. That'll provide all of the links that we've offered for you today. Thanks everybody for joining us.